Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Hannah Maslin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Oxford Uhuro Centre for Practical Ethics and also Programme Manager on the Oxford Martin Programme on Collective Responsibility for Infectious Disease. And it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dr Alberto Giubilini, who's going to talk to us about his new book, The Ethics of Vaccination, which he's developed as part of his role on the Oxford Martin Programme on Collective Responsibility for Infectious Disease. Alberto has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Milan, and prior to joining the Uhuro Centre, he worked in Australia at Monash University, at the University of Melbourne, and at Charles Sturt University. And he's published on lots of different topics in bioethics, but his recent work has been mostly focused on vaccination and infectious disease. So I should say before we start that this talk is being live streamed and recorded, and this will continue over the portion dedicated to question and answer as well. So just bear that in mind if it affects whether or not you ask a question. And there will be a drinks reception following the talk and the discussion in the cafe, which you're all invited to join. So without further ado, I will hand over to Alberto.
So thank you, Hannah. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you to the Oxford Martin School for organizing this. So I'll try to speak for roughly half an hour, and then hopefully there will be some questions. It's good to see many familiar faces here. Thanks for coming, really. I really appreciate that. So let me start by telling you a story, a very short story, so that you get, in the meanwhile, you get used to my Italian accent as I speak. So, because you need to adjust to that. So I had this uncle, so this is related to vaccination, I promise. So I had this uncle when I was younger. It wasn't really my uncle, it was my dad's uncle. And he was very old, one of these people, one of these relatives that you go and see every Christmas, but you don't see for the rest of the year. And this uncle died when he was 101, almost 101, a few days before his birthday, actually. Was called Zio Giovanni, so Uncle John, let's say. So Zio Giovanni was very, very healthy. And as it happens, a few months before he died, he took, for the first time in his life, the flu vaccine. So he got the flu vaccine, and then 2-3 months later, he started feeling unwell, and he died. He was 101. And I remember my dad and my relatives they kept telling me these things about, well, we don't know, he was always very healthy, and then he took the vaccine and he died, so I don't know. So I grew up with this idea that maybe vaccines were not such a great thing after all, because my Zio Giovanni died, he was 101. So, and this thing, so this story is not in the book, but this thing, I remember about this a few weeks ago, because I read this piece of news in an Italian newspaper, so you probably wouldn't understand this. So this is a piece of news, so it's about a person who died, he was 105. And the children, so 2 sons, I think, they said, look, he took the flu vaccine and he started feeling unwell, and he died a few months later. Now, at that age, you probably don't expect to live much longer. And it can happen that anything you do might be the thing that you've done just before you die, like from having breakfast to having pizza. But this thing is interesting because, so it's interesting that these things made the newspapers, right? So because my uncle's, my Zio Giovanni story didn't make the newspaper, but this one did. And this is, I think, symptomatic of a sort of rhetoric and narratives around vaccines that has become quite widespread recently. Not just among lay public, so people who maybe don't know much or don't have any responsibility about public health, about the correct information of people. So this is something that comes up increasingly more frequently For example, among politicians. So this is still about Italy. And I keep talking about Italy because I've been following about a bit this debate. But these things doesn't happen just in Italy. So this is the Italian Ministry of Interior, I would say. So this is one of the most important ministries in Italy. And he is quite opposed to vaccines. But he covers this role. It's a great responsibilities for institutional responsibilities. And a few months ago, he said this thing during a radio interview. He said, I think that 10 compulsory vaccines are useless and in many cases dangerous. So he said, I think, and he's a ministry, so I think that the vaccines can be dangerous. He doesn't have any background in science, medicine. He doesn't even have a degree, actually. But he said he thinks the vaccines have these effects. And that's a big problem. So this is part of this populist government we have now in Italy. I won't talk about this, but that's a problem that it's a problem that he thinks in the first place, because that has bad consequences. But it's a problem that he thinks about vaccines specifically, because he doesn't have any expertise, but he has strong influence on people's attitudes and views, and this can be very, very dangerous. So it's not vaccines that are dangerous, it's these kind of things that can be dangerous. So this was a bit of a joke, but this is not a joke, this is true, but I was joking a bit. But these things can become very, very extreme. So this is another example of the anti-vax movement in Italy. So many people now started comparing vaccines, so people who are in favor of vaccines to the Nazi. So this sign is pretty clear, and this was something that was put on, like, as a poster in some cities recently. So they were comparing the Nazi practices of excluding children from school based on this theory about the superiority of the Aryan race to the exclusion of children from schools based on the theory of herd immunity, as they said. So this is this is a bit less fun. It's very dangerous, very bad, very offensive. Not so much towards people who are in favor of vaccines, but towards the real victims of the Nazis. But that's more or less the state of the debate in Italy, but as I was saying, not just in Italy, many places. And so there clearly is a problem here. So there is a problem because these people are clearly wrong, and there are consequences of these kinds of attitudes. So these people are clearly wrong because vaccines do make a difference. So this graphic shows the drop in cases of measles in the UK after the introduction of the measles vaccines in the 60s. Measles is a very dangerous disease. So as are many other infectious diseases, like the seasonal flu is a very dangerous infectious disease. People can die of it. So I've put some data here. I will not go through this, but the problem is quite serious. So vaccines work, vaccines make a difference, but it seems that because of this kind of attitude towards vaccines recently, vaccines are making a difference in another sense. So there has been an increase in the number of cases of measles and other infectious diseases across Europe in recent years, partly because of this kind of attitude that people have towards vaccines, both in the UK, in Europe. So you can see how dramatically the number of measles cases increased recently. And even in countries like the UK, where, like last year, I think for the first time, the UK reached the threshold for herd immunity for the measles vaccines, but still there are pockets of under-vaccinations in the country. So there are outbreaks of measles. Around 40 people died in between 2017 and 2018 in Europe of measles. So we're talking about an area of the world where the vaccines are easily available, relatively cheap, so there are no significant barriers to accessing vaccines. So this means that something needs to be done here. So, and when we say that something needs to be done, I mean some public policy needs to be implemented to address this problem. And when we have to implement public policies, we always need to think about the ethics, so the ethical aspects of policy making. So there are many ethical issues that vaccination raises and that failure to vaccinate raises. There are different perspectives from which you can address the issue of vaccination and failure to vaccinate. So I was lucky enough for the last couple of years, well, 3 years now, to work here at the Oxford Martin School within this research group, this program on collective responsibility for infectious disease, which includes many, many experts from different disciplines. And that was very helpful to me because all of these perspectives that you can take on the issue of vaccination, I tried somehow to put those, so what I've learned in these 3 years of working with these people, these experts, I've tried to put that in the book and to try to make sense of these things and to sort of give an ethical assessment of the problem. So you can address vaccination, of course, from a medical point of view, epidemiological point of view, from a psychological point of view. So there are people who have biases that affects the vaccination decisions. So you can explain their behavior through certain cognitive biases or decision biases. There is a sociological dimension, so it's interesting to see which kind of social groups and social cultural groups have lower vaccination rates. There's an epistemic problem that people have false beliefs about vaccines and they fail to correct their beliefs. There are cultural and religious elements, so there are some religious communities who are against vaccines. There is an interesting historical perspective on vaccination policies, and that's all very, very interesting. And as I said, I was lucky enough to work in this group where there are really great people and experts on all these topics. But my book is not primarily about all these things because I'm not an expert in any of these things. My book is about the ethics of vaccination, so the ethical aspects and more specifically about public health ethics. So this is what you will find in my book if you have the patience to read it. It's quite a short book, so it won't take much time. Now, this book is about the ethics of vaccination and of vaccination policies. Now, you might think, so why do we need an ethics of vaccination? What kind of ethical values are at stake here? So if you have some people who refuse to vaccinate their children, or maybe some people, they just don't vaccinate their children without explicitly refusing vaccines, but there are all sorts of explanations. Some people just don't think about it. So how do we address this problem from an ethical point of view? So ethics, so now there are many philosophers here in the audience, so I'm not going into this, but we can say that ethics is, among other things, about doing things that are not only, or not even primarily, or not at all in our own self-interest, but also, even primarily, in the interest of other people. So when we talk about vaccination, so of course there are different reasons why you might want to vaccinate yourself or your children, and one is based on self-interest. Of course, vaccination is good for you, it's good for your children, so you might think we don't even need an ethics of vaccination because vaccination is good for you. I'm not going to discuss this, so vaccination is good for you, trust me. But the problem is that some people don't think so, or some people don't give this fact enough consideration. So often this aspect is not enough to convince people to vaccinate themselves or their children. But there are two other reasons why people should vaccinate themselves or their children. So vaccination prevents harm to others. So if you have an infectious disease and you get close to someone who is not vaccinated, you risk infecting this person. And as we saw before, certain infectious diseases can be very, very dangerous, even lethal. And vaccination, every individual vaccination contributes to an important public good. So this is basically what my book is about. So these two aspects of vaccination. So you vaccinate children because it's in their interest, but you also vaccinate children to protect other people and to contribute to an important public good. Now, the public good in question is herd immunity. Herd immunity is a condition where a sufficiently high percentage of population is vaccinated against a certain infectious disease so that those who are not vaccinated can be protected. And it is a public good because, well, in the technical sense of the term, so again, I will not go into too many details, but the point is that people benefit from public goods regardless of whether they contribute to them. and there is no way of excluding people from benefiting from public goods. Like if in this room you're all vaccinated and I'm not, I will be protected. So, and as long as, so assuming this is the whole world, of course, so I will be protected. So vaccination is a public good in this, herd immunity is a public good in this sense. And it is also a matter of collective responsibility. So here is where, so this is the title of the program we've been working on here. So it's collective responsibility for infectious disease. What does it mean? It means that I cannot realize herd immunity, you cannot realize herd immunity. It takes a large number of people to realize herd immunity. So we all have to make our contribution. Well, not all. Enough of us need to make their contribution. So there are different ethical values at stake here, and that's what my book focuses on. So when there is a collective responsibility to realize an important public good, there is a relevant issue of fairness in the distribution of the burdens of a collective responsibility, right? So it doesn't make a difference to the level of vaccination coverage in any given area whether any single individual is not vaccinated. It doesn't make any difference at all. So in the sense that herd immunity would or would not obtain regardless of whether any single individual is vaccinated. So why should any single individual be vaccinated against certain infectious diseases? Well, because it is fair. It is simply fair to make one's own fair contribution to a public good that is as important as herd immunity. So fairness is the value that really grounds the ethical obligation to vaccinate yourself and your children. And it's the link between the collective responsibility and the individual responsibility. So even if you live in an area where there is herd immunity at the moment, and so you don't have any strong enough self-interest reason to vaccinate your child, there is still a requirement of fairness to make your fair contribution to the public good in question. And it's a matter of individual responsibility. So often we have more responsibilities to do something, even when it does not make a difference. I say even when it does not make a difference, although it is possible and indeed likely that every single individual being vaccinated will make a difference because levels of herd immunity, of vaccination coverage vary across time. We cannot be sure that if we have herd immunity this year, there will be herd immunity next year. And we might realize too late that we no longer have herd immunity. Usually we realize that when we notice like an increase in infection rates, and that's too late. So we need to prevent that. So we need really to stress there are these important ethical values at stake. Fairness and preventing harm to others. Sorry for another Italian example. So this is a piece of news in Italian newspaper recently, and that's a clear example of what I just said. So there have been interesting many of these kind of pieces of news recently. So it's about cases in which an entire classroom, all students in a classroom gets vaccinated because there is one of their schoolmates, classmates that has some a compromised immune system. So people with compromised immune systems cannot be vaccinated. So the only way for them to be protected against infectious diseases is to have enough people around them vaccinated. So there has been this case, it's not the only one, there have been many others, of like entire students in a classroom who got vaccinated against the flu or measles to protect one child so as to allow the child to go to school. And what I found interesting is that many of these cases, including this one, so the minister, so in this case the Ministry of Education in Italy, publicly praised the schoolmates, so they talked about this act of solidarity. So they said that he's very proud of their behavior, so this was emphasized in the media. And I thought, that's all good, of course, that's very good, but there is also something worrying if we live in a society where this kind of things needs to be praised and make the news. So this should be a basic, decent moral behavior, the fact that you get vaccinated or you vaccinate your children to protect others, because the cost is very small, the benefit to the child is large, or to yourself is large, but also you contribute to a public good and you prevent serious harm to other people. So this is a basic moral obligation, really. So, and I'm very worried that we live in a world in which these things make the news and in which the Ministry of Education speaks out to praise these things. It shouldn't be necessary in the ideal world where I would like to live, right? So it shouldn't be necessary. Now, But it's good that these children, or I don't know which kind of, how old they were, but it's good that they got vaccinated. But I want to say that this should become the norm. These kind of things shouldn't make the headlines. And in my book, I try to argue, to ground these individuals and collective moral obligations to be vaccinated and vaccinate one children. So for the public good and to prevent harm to others. Now, from the point of view of policy making, so the main question is whether these kinds of moral obligations are enforceable. So you might well say, okay, there is a moral obligation to be vaccinated, but the state cannot compel me to vaccinate myself or my children. So not all the moral duties we have are enforceable, of course. I think that we have moral duty, for example, not to eat meat, because I'm a vegetarian. I think it's unethical to eat meat, but the state, I don't think the state should, well, maybe I do think that the state, but most people wouldn't think that the state should compel or will be entitled to compel people to go vegetarian, for example. Now, in this case, I think that this is a kind of moral obligation that can be enforced for two reasons. First of all, because the public good at stake is so important. So we're talking about the level of public health in a country, which is important for people's, individuals' health, but it's also important for economic reasons. So there are all this data about how outbreaks of infectious diseases significantly impact on the economy of a country. And most importantly, public health, a good enough level of public health is something that the state has a strong responsibility to guarantee. So one of the institutional responsibilities of the state is to guarantee herd immunity. So one of the chapters of the book is about this interrelation between institutional responsibility, collective responsibilities, and individual responsibilities. So the book, so this is the main thesis of the book. So vaccination should be compulsory. Compulsory is not a bad word, it's a good word in certain cases. So compulsion is good, because you are forced to contribute to the good, so the public good of a country, in this case, to a good level of public health. So there are different kinds of reasons why in the book I argue that vaccination should be compulsory. The main reason is that it works. It can work if properly implemented. For example, compulsory vaccination worked very well in Italy, although that ministry before was strongly against, and there is a strong movement against compulsory vaccination, but vaccination in Italy did work. So there have been studies about the increase of vaccination uptake for the MMR vaccine. MMR is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine in the last year. In the last few months, 3 regions in Italy, so Piemonte, Trentino, and Veneto, they reached the threshold for herd immunity for measles, the measles vaccine, and that wasn't the case before, and this is the result of compulsory vaccination. So compulsory vaccination means that there is a heavy penalty, financial penalty on parents that don't vaccinate their children. So compulsory vaccination can work if properly implemented. It's fair, because it compels people to make their fair contribution to the public good. It doesn't allow for free riders. It doesn't allow for people to fail to make their fair share. And it ensures that individual and collective responsibility are fulfilled. So I think there is a strong ethical case for compulsory vaccination, including when it's about one's children. So one might say, okay, that might work for adults, but how can the state compel me to vaccinate my children? And also, how can you claim that I have a moral obligation to vaccinate my child? Well, that's true. So it's more problematic when it comes to making moral choice not for yourself but for someone else, like your children. But one point I make in the book is that parents make all sorts of decisions on behalf of their children or that affect their children. And there is no reason why an ethical choices, ethical decisions shouldn't be among these kind of decisions made either on behalf of or affecting one children. So that would only be a problem if vaccination was harmful, was not in the child's best interest, would be a heavy burden on children, but that's not the case. So the cost is minimal. It's actually beneficial for children. So there is no reason why these moral obligation shouldn't also apply to decisions about one's children. So in this case, the ethical obligation is not on parents to vaccinate themselves. So the ethical obligation based on fairness is on parents to vaccinate their children. There are, of course, alternatives to compulsory vaccination. So I have a chapter in the book about this. So you can have just information campaigns, persuasions, nudging, some form of like maybe opt-out systems for vaccination. We're doing some work on that here at the Oxford Martin School. You can have incentives for vaccination, so you pay people to vaccinate their children. I see many problems with these kind of alternatives, though. And one problem is that they might not work all the time, so we don't know. So in England, in the UK, last year, we reached the level of herd immunity for measles without any compulsory vaccination policy in place, but that wasn't the case the years before. It might not be the case the next year, so we need to guarantee that the vaccination coverage rate remain constant and above the threshold for herd immunity, which for measles is 95%. It's not fair because if you have milder policies, some people will be able to get away, so to be protected without contributing to the public good. So collective and individual responsibility might not be fulfilled. And also about incentives, some people have proposed incentives for vaccination. I don't agree with that because I think that people should not be paid for doing something that they have a moral obligation to do. I think they should be coerced into doing that if they don't fulfill their moral obligation. So people should be paid to do something only when that something is supererogatory, so it goes beyond the call of duty. But if you have a moral obligation to do something, I think the state is allowed to force you to fulfill your obligation. Of course, there are some small risks with vaccines. That's true. So we need to be clear about that. There are some, and I've put some data here. However, the risks of infectious diseases are much higher. The most dangerous side effects, some of the most dangerous side effects, or possible side effects, because sometimes the evidence is not so clear, of vaccines, are also present in the case of the infectious diseases that these vaccines are supposed to protect you from. But the point here is that, again, this is an ethical choice. I said before that ethics is about making some sacrifices, self-sacrifices, for the sake of other people and for the sake of public good. So if vaccination is an ethical choice, as I try to suggest here, but as I argue, hopefully a bit more extensively and convincingly in the book, then also risks have to be distributed fairly. So, and as I said, vaccination is an ethical choice because it protects other people, it prevents harms to other people, and the harms of infectious diseases are much more serious than the harm and more likely to occur than the harms of vaccines, but also is a matter of making one's fair contribution to public goods. Now, this is my dog, Idea. She's called, so many of you have met her. So there are two reasons why I have this photo here, this picture here. First of all, because she's very cute, and it's always good to have a cute picture in the presentation. So if you don't like the presentation, at least you got a cute dog, which is always worth it. Is she cute, right? Yeah. And the second reason is that this is her vaccination certificate. So to bring this dog into the UK, she had to do, well, these are some of the vaccinations she had to do. I don't even remember what they are. There are more. This is just one page. So in this country, vaccination is compulsory for dogs and cats and some other kind of pets. And I could have put some other pictures of the other vaccination stamps that she had to do, but then I would have had to have a smaller picture of the dog, so I prefer to keep a large picture. But it's a bit strange that in this country, but I say this country, but most countries, I don't want to criticize the UK specifically, in most countries, we are more worried about the state of health and infectious diseases for animals than for humans. The suffering of animals for infectious diseases is at least as important as the suffering of humans. The life of humans is more important than the life of animals, and you can die for infectious disease. So I don't know why I had to do all these things for the dog, but there is no vaccination requirement in many countries, and this sounds a bit strange. Why do we care so much about the health of dogs and not about the health of humans? Yes, so this is basically what I wanted to conclude with, so it's good to end with a picture. But I want to take, if I have a couple of minutes, we're a bit, yeah. So this is a very important part of the talk, acknowledgments. Let me spend a couple of minutes. So first of all, For the book, I want to thank Francesca Minerva, so my wife. So this book is dedicated to her. And when I started writing this book, I thought that she would read it. And that's always the reason why I try to do the best I can, because I know that she would read it. So I hope the book is up to the standard. So my first thanks is to Francesca. And then, well, some more institutional acknowledgments. So first of all, the Euro Center for Practical Ethics. So I've been working at the Euro Center for the last 3 years. Best research center in the world, if I may say so. So I'm really thankful to all the people working there, including the administration staff. So it was really great, and probably the book wouldn't have been, I don't know if it's good, but wouldn't have been so good. Even if it's bad, it wouldn't have been that good if I had worked in a different environment. So really thanks to the UHERO community, the UHERO people. And also, of course, thanks to the Oxford Martin School for organizing the events, for funding my research. So these are all the people who worked on the program on collective responsibility for infectious disease, of which this book is an output. So these are the list of researchers. So as I said before, they are from different disciplines. And honestly, I cannot think of any single person in this list that somehow didn't contribute to the book by giving advice, information, inputs. Some of these people, especially who read parts of the book here in yellow, and gave me very valuable feedback. So I'm really thankful to these people and to the Oxford Martin School for funding this research. And finally, of course, to the Wellcome Trust and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. Part of my research was funded by that. So this is a newly established center in Oxford. Great center, so it's expanding slowly. Great people working there, again, from different disciplines. So it's always valuable to have these good people giving inputs from different disciplines. And the Wellcome Trust funded not only part of my research, but also the open access. So this is very important. You don't need to buy this book. This book is open access. This link, if you go to the website of Palgrave, you can download it for free. So if you don't like the book, it's okay, because you haven't spent anything. So thank you to all these people and all these institutions for funding my research. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alberto. So we've got some time for questions now, just short of 25 minutes. So if you have questions, put your hands up and keep them up for a little bit so that I've seen you, and then I'll take them in the order that I see you, and there'll be a microphone coming round, so wait for the microphone before you start asking your question. I saw this hand first, so we'll start there, and the rest of you keep your hands up if you have questions.
You say that you would make it compulsory to have vaccinations. What then would be the penalty if people don't vaccinate their children, and how would you then implement a penalising system, and what would be the cost effectiveness of that as well?
Yeah, thank you. So that's an important question, because it helps to clarify things. So some people distinguish between mandatory vaccination and compulsory vaccination. And the difference being that in the case of compulsory vaccination, there are legal penalties. So for example, in Italy, the penalty for non-vaccination of school-age children is, I think, 500 euros. Whereas, for example, in the US, they have a different system of mandatory vaccination. So with mandatory vaccination, it is not illegal, so there are no legal penalties if you don't vaccinate your children, but you cannot enroll your children in schools, so you have to provide homeschooling. That's perfectly legal, you can do it. But that's a slight difference. So the point is that what the penalty should be, it depends on what kind of penalty is effective. So there will always be a certain, say, amount of money or a certain penalty that people will not be prepared to pay for not vaccinating their children. That might depend on different contexts, different states, different circumstances. I cannot give you a figure that would apply to every case, but you have to figure out what the right level of penalty is. Of course, there will always be people who get away. That's true for any kind of law. Taxation, for example. So there are penalties if you evade your taxes. There are people who do that. But you have to enforce proper policing, which is doable. Some people are skeptical that it's doable, but it's working in Italy, so it's doable. You have to figure out what the right penalty would be.
Okay, the gentleman here with the green shirt.
Thanks so much, Alberto. My name is Andres. I'm just also wondering about, if it were to be mandatory, what would the program look like to ensure that everyone is covered? or that the herd immunity is met, particularly in cases where there are hard to reach communities and herd immunity. Particularly in the cases where there are hard to reach communities, whether that's spatially or just due to access to the healthcare system. If you can just comment on what the model would look like.
Yeah. So these are very practical issues. Now, I've talked more about the principle that justifies implementing these kinds of policies. And in practice, I think I'm not a policymaker, but well, one thing that could help is something that many countries do not have, is having a register of vaccinations. Italy doesn't have that, for example. But like you can have a database where every person, for example, registers for other kinds of documents, say for an ID or a passport, automatically is reported to the system so that you know whether this person is vaccinated or not. And then you can enforce the law. So there are different strategies that you can use. I think, but I'm not sure, that I read something that Cesar sent me some time ago about some South American country where they wouldn't release your passport if you are not vaccinated. I'm not sure about this though, so I would have to check. But just this to say, there are different kinds of strategies you can implement in order to ensure that people are monitored and get vaccinated. Yeah.
Okay, there's a lady at the back over there, and people on this side who had their hands up, please put them up again. My pen ran out, so I didn't. Okay, great, thank you.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering, in your opinion, at what level of safety and efficacy would you actually need before you would consider it to be ethical to implement a compulsory vaccination program?
Well, a very high level of safety. Again, I cannot give you a number, but vaccines that are normally included in mandatory or compulsory vaccination schemes are very, very safe. Like the flu vaccine, the MMR vaccines, so they are very, very safe. I think there will need to be very rigid controls and trials about the drugs. So some vaccines are not as effective as others. For example, the pertussis vaccine is not that effective, but I will focus more on the safety rather than the effectiveness. So if a vaccine doesn't work, that might not be that bad as long as enough people are vaccinated, so you can compensate for that. The real problem is safety. But the vaccines that are now included in mandatory and compulsory policies are very, very safe. And I cannot give you a number, but I will put the threshold very high, of course, because if you compel people to do something, the risk you can pose on people should ideally be minimal. So, and the risk should be lower than the risk of infectious disease, of course, because if it is, maybe some people think it is better to catch an infectious disease instead of the vaccine, then okay, that's problematic. But yeah.
Okay, Anders was next. Sorry, Clara.
That's all right. It's good for me.
Thank you. So you have been focusing on vaccines, but it seems like the argument might be general. Are there other areas in medicine and public health that would have the same kind of reasoning? It would seem that some aspects of hygiene might also, it seems like your argument would apply to them too, that it might be actually mandatory to maintain certain hygienic standards.
Yeah, definitely. So hygiene standards is one thing, or like staying home when you're sick, for example. So that's basic moral obligations. You contribute to containing infectious diseases. In one way, more interesting and more challenging problem of public health is antibiotic resistance, for example. So this is another area we're working on the project here at Oxford Martin School. So we need to reduce the collective consumption of antibiotics to preserve their effectiveness, which might mean that some people might need to, that's not clear, but it might be the case that at some point some people might need to forgo antibiotics in certain cases, like you need to stay in bed for more days to recover naturally from infection in order to preserve the common good of antibiotic effectiveness. So, and again, there are reasons of fairness, preventing harm to others, contributing to collective good, but that's more problematic because it's way more demanding to forgo antibiotics, of course, than to be vaccinated. So there are some common themes, but not exactly the same in this case.
Okay, is the lady over here with the coloured laptop?
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My question is maybe a bit vague at this point, but your talk made me think about empathy a lot.
About empathy?
Empathy, yeah. Because it seems to me like a lot of this kind of ethical responsibility, kind of the way that plays out on a very kind of human level seems to me anyway, through empathy and through empathizing with people and creating a collective good. That seems to me to do with empathy. So I wondered kind of whether a compulsory system of vaccination would respond to those kind of very human concerns about kind of risk and things like that, and just wondered if you'd explored that at all. Vague.
No, it wouldn't.
No.
I think, I don't know, I don't have any empirical, but I don't think that the compulsory vaccination would enhance empathy. On the other hand, I don't think that empathy has done much so far, at least with regard to this problem, because we all see these pictures of these children with measles. We know all these facts about people dying of severe infectious diseases. Many people are not really moved by that, and it would be ideal if empathy was enough, and it would be ideal if there were policies that would enhance empathy and just convince people to vaccinate themselves. But people respond differently to these things, and not everybody would do that. People have different levels of empathy. And also, the thing is that when you're contributing to a collective good, you're not really making a choice that affects a specific individual. So empathy works if you have a specific individual in mind or a specific face in mind. It doesn't really work when you talk about public goods, collectives, because as far as I know, as far as my experience goes, empathy is not triggered by these abstract concepts. But if we want something like herd immunity, so herd immunity is like it's about a collective. You don't put faces on herd immunity. It's a group. So I'm a bit skeptical about working on empathy. I'm a bit skeptical if it worked. If it did work, I would be inclined to support.
Well, I was thinking about the other way around. So
Yeah.
So I was thinking about how, for example, if people are resistant to vaccinating their kids or whatever, the example of kind of autism, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines comes to mind. I was thinking that a compulsory program doesn't really respond to those sorts of concerns. It doesn't really.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
no,
I
maybe,
mean, your answer
maybe.
kind of still stands.
But
yeah.
here you want a policy that works. You don't want a policy that, because at some point, also coercion. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of coercion to change social norms.
Yeah.
If you coerce people to do something, people will get used to that, and that will become. Often it will become a social norm. That work, for example, with prohibition to smoke in public spaces, like in indoor spaces. Seatbelt laws work that way. So there are many instances in which coercion simply works. It doesn't matter, but it would be good if empathy was a factor here, but I'm a bit skeptical. So
No, thank you.
yeah, no, but that's a good point. Yeah, it's definitely a good point. Yes, thank you.
Matt, right at the back.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I haven't read your book, so I'm wary maybe you've addressed it in there, but I'm interested to what extent your conception of fairness is based, I guess, on just a pure utilitarian sort of calculus of, small harm or small imposition, large benefit, and to what extent it's something else, linked to, I guess, health or, in that sense, illness. You gave the example of the class where a single person was, potentially vulnerable to something and the whole class was vaccinated. So if you take, for example, some disease that could be vaccinated against, but perhaps is only, a certain proportion of the population would be vulnerable to, does the same argument for compulsory vaccination extend in that sense, or is it something more complicated when?
Well, like for example, what kind of disease? Do you mean that disease that only like a small proportion of the population is vulnerable? Well,
yeah. So in that sense, the kind of calculus of the
you have an example, specific disease in mind?
No, I mean,
okay.
But I assume some diseases. Yes.
I think that would still apply to the extent that getting vaccinated is almost costless. So, problem is that, even if these people are a small group, I don't know exactly what kind of disease, but even if these people are a small group, so if it doesn't cost much to protect these people, then of course you have a moral obligation to do that. Problem is where the burden, so if you're reasoning from a utilitarian perspective, then the problem will be when the burden to do something like to be vaccinated will be larger, heavier than the burden that these people would experience if they got the disease. But yes, I would say that this argument would apply equally. So suppose that extreme case is one person in a country that is vulnerable to a certain disease. Well, still, this person has a right to health. And a right to health, there is no such a thing as an absolute right, of course. You always have to weigh different things. But if the cost of protecting this person is very small, then of course there is a moral obligation to do that, and a moral obligation of fairness. Now, you said you try to connect fairness and utilitarianism. Now, my argument is not utilitarian here, so it's just about making your fair contribution. But there is a consequentialist aspect of fairness as well. So that's maybe not related to your question, but since you brought up this connection. So there is this thing that often philosophers talk about, this problem of assurance. So that's something that means that often people are motivated to make their contribution to a public good only if they know that other people do the same, right? That's because we have this sense of fairness. And fairness, in this case, would work also in that sense, because if I know that all of you are vaccinated, that all of you are contributing, that takes away a disincentive, a psychological disincentive for me to vaccinate, because everybody's doing their fair share, so I have a feeling that I should do the same. If people don't, it's like with taxes. So I'm happy to pay my taxes if I know that other people do that. But if I know that many people don't pay their taxes, then I say, so, okay, I'm not making my fair contribution as well. So there is a connection between fairness and utilitarianism, but not, I would say, not in the sense that you put in the way you put it. Was it clear? Yeah, sorry.
So I think, yes, this keep your hands up if you still want to ask a question, just so I can make sure I've got you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. You see, as a scientist, I found myself dealing with anti-vaxxers in the past, unfortunately. And what I sensed is that when they realize that I'm a scientist, they see me as part of a system, like an enemy. And one thing that I see in you is that you start impartial. So what you're bringing to the table is somewhat refreshing. Even I myself, that I support mandatory vaccinations, I felt good. The philosopher said it, so absolutely. So what I'm saying is that people in this room are probably agreeing with me that mandatory vaccinations are good. The thing is that by being in this room, they're already selected.
Yeah.
So what are you doing to reach those people that would not come to this meeting? And now I speak as a fellow Italian. Are you planning on taking this to the parliament of our country or other countries? Thank you.
We've been working on some policy papers as part of this project, but so I knew that by giving this talk here, I would be preaching to the converted. So I'm not so sure that everybody's in favor of mandatory vaccination here. I'm sure that everybody thinks that the vaccines are a good thing. These are two different things. So compulsory or mandatory vaccination, that's another thing, because it's about the legitimate level of coercion that the state can impose on people. So I'm not so sure that everybody will be on board with me about compulsory vaccination. So I briefly addressed this thing in the book. So how do you convince people? Well, at some point, this might sound too hard. So we need to have more information campaigns. We need to enhance trust in the public health system, in scientists. That's a more like sociological problem. So how do you get people to trust scientists? At some point, though, we shouldn't care much about what people trust or think, because if a policy is fair, if a policy works, that's all you need from an ethical point of view, in my view. Okay. Also, you said so philosophers are impartial. So there are many philosophers in the room. Philosophers disagree, so I'm sure many people will disagree with this. But as a philosopher, what I can say is that once a policy is fair, it works, and the good at stake is sufficiently important for the collective, at some point we can give up trying to convince people. We can coerce people because the coercion is legitimate. We did that in many other cases. seatbelt requirements, as I said before, like prohibiting alcohol, prohibiting smoking in indoor places. So people weren't happy. People didn't trust mandatory seatbelt laws at the beginning because they said it was like a lobby thing from producers, I don't know. But then it became a social norm, it worked, and that's all we need.
Yeah, I agree. What about lawmakers then?
Lawmakers?
Sorry, we're going to have to move on to, we've got 3 more questions.
You talk about later, yes.
So there are 2 over here and 1 at the front, and then I think we're going to be out of time. And if you can try to be concise, that would be good. So yeah, first one over there.
So I saw a story in the news a few weeks ago, and it was a boy, an American boy, and his parents were anti-vaxxers, but he wasn't. So he had to wait until he was old enough to make his own medical decisions, and then he got himself vaccinated. So do you think we should educate children in school, like implement programs in schools, so that they can also make these decisions for themselves?
Yeah, so I think we should, depends on what you think by policy, but we should educate children in school. Problem is that from a legal point of view, you cannot have, well, I'm not sure if you can have children consent to these things. That's why I stress that the responsibility is on parents, and that's very important. So it's parents that make a decision for their children. Children are making their own decision for their own good. Usually, when it's in the child's best interest, and there is at least one parent that is pro-vax, usually they rule in favor of the pro-vax parent. But you need at least one parent to be in favor of vaccination. That's very problematic. To be honest, I don't know how to do that when the child wants to do something which is in their interest. But that's more of a legal problem. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and then lady just in front, just here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So as a paediatrician, I spend a fair amount of time talking to parents who don't want to vaccinate their children. And a lot of the anxiety comes from, as you mentioned, side effects, and a lot of these not well recognized side effects, so things like autism related to MMR or otherwise. But in a compulsory vaccination scenario, is there any room for a compensation aspect for people who have genuine side effects from vaccines, albeit very small, very rare, when you're vaccinating a whole population?
There are vaccine injury compensation schemes because side effects happen. So we need to acknowledge that. And if you have compulsory vaccination, it means you vaccinate 1 million of children. So even if the rate is like 1 case in 1 million or 2 million, like the Guillain-Barré syndrome, for example, then at some point statistically it will happen. And there are vaccine injury compensation schemes in many countries. That doesn't mean that the state is responsible for coercing people. It means that people are entitled to compensate. Sometimes bad things happen and no one is responsible because the policy of the state is ethically justified. So yeah, there should be compensations for that. I think, because at some point it's not people's choice, it's the state's choice. So yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, and the final question was right at the front.
My name is Obari, I'm from Tokyo, Japan, and according to the WHO, about 50,000 people got killed by rabies, And when I came to Oxford, I was always scared. I see many dogs around, and are they vaccinated or just we are safe? Also, even when I go and visit Southeast Asia, there are many, many dogs, Dogs. And I try to stay away. And so, how would you deal with such an issue here in the UK, also around the world?
About dogs?
Yeah.
Well, but that's how we did. So my dog had to be vaccinated. It was compulsory to. She was vaccinated against rabies, right? Yeah. Okay. So my wife did all the vaccination. So yes. So, but that's compulsory. Exactly. That's what I meant. So I'm sure the dogs you see here don't have rabies because they're vaccinated because it's compulsory. Assuming people comply with the law. I don't know, but it's the same argument. That's the way to go. You compel people to vaccinate children and pets. Yes. I have the same answer to the question. Yes.
Okay, so join me in thanking Alberto.
Thank you very much for coming.
And as I said, there will now be a drinks reception in the cafe. Some of you are signed up to come to the dinner with us afterwards. You'll know if you've signed up, and unfortunately our places are limited to those who are signed up. But we can go over together at 6:45 or 6:30. So 6:30. If you're coming to the dinner then and you want to walk with us, then meet at 6:30.